You, Elsa. I'm really honored to be allowed to speak to secondary school teachers. I taught at secondary school for nearly 20 years, and I really missed those years. After that, I went to university, and it's not quite the same thing. So thank you for attending, and I hope, although I'm supposed to be speaking, I would love to hear your experiences of teaching about the history of Africa and slavery. So Elsa asked me to visualize or give an idea of how I visualize slavery, the history of slavery in my teaching. So I've prepared a PowerPoint. The whole thing is a series of slides, which I prepared for my students. So I'm sharing screenshots of them. You may not be able to read all of them.
Vijaya, I don't
Let me
think your
see.
screen is shared yet.
Yes, I'm going to share it
Okay,
now.
got it.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just explaining what the slides are composed of. So it's basically extracts of classes I've had and what I've presented to students. So the first thing, I think very important, the experience of the enslaved in Mauritius before even starting to look at the experience directly of Mauritius. It's very important in Mauritius to take account of the perceptions of the students even before they come into the classroom. They already have, I would say, standard ideas that they have obtained from the media or from family or from newspapers, and also the many public commemorations we have of the abolition of slavery, beginning of indenture, and so on. So they come to class already with some preconceived notions. And what I tend to do is to discuss this in class and then look at these stereotypes that we tend to perpetuate in Mauritius, even though the historical truth may be something else. So first, this is something Richard has brought out very clearly in his presentation, the multiplicity of ethnicities and cultural origins of people being traded in the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. In Mauritius, there is this stereotype that all slaves are African and are people of African origin, and that we are all people of African origin are descended from slavery. This is a stereotype we have in Mauritius, that all those who came as indentured laborers after the abolition of slavery were all Indian or Asian. And finally, the third stereotype that we often hear from students, that all colonizers or slave owners were all from French or British origin, or all white as the word that we tend to use in Mauritius. So what we do try to show from the very beginning that the slave population was a very culturally heterogeneous community, deriving from all parts of the Indian Ocean and beyond. We have quite a few slaves were brought from West Africa. Many were Malagasy, not only from the continent mainland. And I'm very happy to see a fellow historian from Madagascar, Chaplain Tut, in the audience. Among indentured laborers, we have many thousands of Comorians, Mozambicans, Madagascar, who came as indentured laborers after abolition of slavery. So not all people of African origin are descended from slavery. And that's a very important distinction to make. And finally, in Mauritius, when you tell students or even members of the public that most of slave owners, the several thousand slave owners that there were at the time of abolition, they were not all French or British, but many were Indian or Malagasy or mixed population. And somehow there's an element of surprise and people don't really accept that. But that is the historical truth. Richard has also talked about the categories of slaveries in the Indian Ocean. And again, it's important at the very outset to know that in Mauritius was an uninhabited island, as was La Réunion and Rodrigues and Seychelles. And so we have never had pre-slavery periods. In other words, what some people call traditional slavery or other forms of unfree labor that existed in the pre-colonial era. Mauritius has never known that. We've only known colonial slavery. And in fact, Mauritius was created out of colonialism. So that's an important distinction to make between mainland Africa and some of the islands of the Indian Ocean. We also introduce students very briefly to different types of slavery, as Richard has mentioned: Asian slavery, military slavery, debt slavery, and so on and so forth. So students are and the Mauritian public are aware that there are many types of uh, uh, um, unfree labor that did exist in the Indian Ocean. Also, the multicultural origins of slaves brought to Mauritius from the Dutch, French, and the British, because we had three colonial powers taking over Mauritius: the Dutch first in the 17th century, and then French 18th, and then British in the 19th. The slaves, as Richard has pointed out, in Mauritius came from all over the Indian Ocean. And I think it's Richard who said sometime that the slave population in Mauritius is probably one of the most diverse that has existed in the Indian Ocean. So it's very important to start off exploring what the context of Mauritius in relation to the rest of the Indian Ocean. Also very important is to show that the slaves were not all one homogeneous group in terms of occupation, not just in origins, but in terms of occupations, and that there was some kind of a hierarchy that existed among the slaves in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the occupations, for example, the slave censuses that we have clearly show the very wide variety of occupations that slaves were involved in. Not all were plantation slaves. This is a stereotype again we have in Mauritius. All slaves worked on sugar plantations. In the 18th century, they worked in many more varied occupations. And you see a few clips here. I don't know if you can see it. It's a bit fuzzy. But we have domestic slaves. We have slaves working in the Navy. We also have slaves who are public slaves, in other words, government slaves owned by the French East India Company, and then afterwards by the royal government, and then Napoleonic government. And these are government slaves who literally were in charge of all the public works in Mauritius on the island, building roads, bridges, manning the ships, shipbuilding, ship repairs, and so on, and building some of the most important infrastructure on the island, which still exists today. So the government slaves, I don't think they exist in many countries, but in Mauritius and Réunion and a few other French colonies, they are very important, small but very important part of the slave population. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a hierarchy among slaves, which has perpetuated up to the 20th century. You see it in generational transmission of occupations, for example. And this is important. Why is this important to teach today? Because in Mauritius, we're very much influenced by our past. A lot of the hierarchization, the occupational structure that we see in Mauritius is very much derived from our historical past, 18th and 19th century, occupations being allocated to slaves, occupations being allocated, as Richard said, to indentured laborers as well. So there are some kind of categories where you do see certain people of African origin being concentrated in, even today in Mauritius. And also the cultural, Pierre Lawson very much showed when he was writing on Mauritius, how there was a multiplicity of languages and cultures spoken and practiced by slaves, even up to the period of the abolition of slavery. Today, we have subsumed all these cultures and languages into one, which is the Creole language. But I always tell students that we must not forget that slaves spoke a multiplicity of languages. They integrated many different cultures that existed in Mauritius into themselves. And we have a very a population that is métissé in Mauritius today. So these clips, I don't know if you can see clearly, also very important is to show that what existed in terms of the economic, racial, social structure in Mauritius has its roots in the 18th century and the 19th century. So on your left, there's a map of Port Louis drawn in 1803, which shows the segregated residential areas in Port Louis. So it was not segregated only on ethnic lines, but also on social status. So, for example, slaves who were government slaves stayed in one quarter. Those who had been freed stayed in another part of the town. Um, those who are West African, for example, we had Wolof slaves. They stayed in a camp dedicated to them, devoted to them. I still haven't quite understood why this was so. But this is Mauritius in the 18th century with a very hierarchical economic structure. Land ownership also is talked about. Land ownership was, in terms of agricultural land, was given only to people of European origin, whereas non-whites would be given smaller plots of land. There are, of course, a few exceptions because free Malagasy did come and own large plots of land and so on. So this is as far as the experience of enslaved population in Mauritius is concerned. The second part that Elsa wanted to talk about was how do we narrate, how do we humanize the history of slavery and how do we teach it? And in more recent years, we're very lucky that in Mauritius there have been so many researchers working on history of slavery for the last 40 years. And that has changed the way we teach history because from the very book-based and using only archival records, over the last 20 years, we have been able to add a lot of interdisciplinary research, as Richard mentioned, archaeology, oral history, linguistic archaeology, literary studies, studies of music, dance, poetry, have been introduced now in the school curriculum and at university level, where a lot of the research is being now shared with our students. So in the last few years, we have been looking at the history of women and of enslaved women, and linking it also to the situation of Black women in Mauritius today. So traditionally, are guilty of that also. When we first started teaching history, we had very little information on women in Mauritius. And if you look at the slide on your left, this is what I encourage students to think about when you look at history books, including my own. The stories are all about ministers and government officials, military personnel, and so on. Very accomplished people, but they're all men. So where were the women? And Marcel, some of the slides are in French. I apologize. We're bilingual, so we alternate between English and French in classes. So Marcel Agès, who's one of the first women historians in Mauritius, she said that men are born Asians, Europeans, French, or British. And she was quoting from a writer, Bernard and Saint-Pierre. They can be cultivators, merchants, soldiers, but everywhere in the world, women are born, they live, and they die women. So for her, this was her statement on the history of women in Mauritius. So what we have tried to do in Mauritius is to look very closely at police and court records. The police daybooks are replete with complaints of women coming to the police station and complaining about, clothes being stolen, or fights between husband and wife, or between slaves themselves, or owner and slave, and so on. And they have given our young researchers, students, a lot of information about the daily life of women. So this has been a very important part. I think someone earlier mentioned what were the roles of women, and someone, I think, said they're mainly domestics. In Mauritius, we do have many women domestics, but if you look at the print on your right-hand side, these are women working in the gunpowder factory in Mauritius, one of the few that existed in the French colonies. And here, even though this is a very dangerous work being done in a gunpowder factory because it could explode and did explode in the past, doing crucial work, sieving charcoal, grating charcoal, and feeding the mill, the gunpowder mill with this. Women were also involved in public works, helping in the exploitation of lime and wood and so on in the capital city. So they're very much involved, not only in domestic service, but in public works and infrastructure. So this is very important to show this part of history of women, that they're not only in the household as family members, and as Richard mentioned, even within the family or in the domestic area, there's a lot of economic activities being performed on the plantation or on the estate. On your right, these are the opportunities that are faced, that women had access to in Mauritius. So on your right is a lithograph by Bernardin Saint-Pierre on a slave maroon woman who has been caught and is now being punished with all the collars and the fetters to prevent her from marooning again. So in a way, this is a atypical lithograph, because for women, marooning was not really an option. If you have a family, you're a woman with children, how do you run to? Where do you run to in the forest and the woods with children in your hand? So what we do have is the idea of manumission. That's the next, I think that was the slide. Manumission becomes one of the outlets for slave women. So how could a slave become freed before the abolition of slavery? There are many ways that they could become. One is by the will of the master giving freedom to the slave for having performed duties, etc. Sometimes slaves were able to save money. Many were market women. They went and sold vegetables or in the market. Others got money from doing chores, going to Port Louis, selling things they had produced, clothing. Many women were seamstresses, and so especially in the town of Port Louis, this was very important. So women were able to escape slavery, but not in the same way as men would have doing marronage. And Richard mentioned the island of Tromlin. I want to show you this because it is so unique in the history of archaeology, in the history of slavery. This is an island that is bare. There's nothing on this island. Yet 11 women were stranded there for so many years with a baby. This was a shipwreck that had occurred. The sailors had been able to escape by building a boat and being rescued by a ship. The male slaves also had tried to build something and were able to escape, leaving the women behind on this island. And a few years ago, an archaeological excavations were held on the island, and you see some of the artifacts here. So there is bracelets, kitchen utensils, combs, and then designs of a comb. And all this had been made on the spot in Tromlin by the women themselves from the wreckage of the ship. So my question was, this is some kind of engendering archaeology. And I asked the archaeologists that at that time, if men had been left on the island, would they have produced combs and jewelry? So that's a question to answer, a lighter part of this story. So this was very interesting. It's another example of how women approach um, life a little bit differently from men. Another thing we have tried to do is to expand our knowledge of the history of slavery, because we have so few, as Richard mentioned, so few archival sources emanating from slaves, and that is to look at family history. So in the last few years, we use the slave registration returns, which are available for the British period, 1830s, and this went into a family history unit, which was based at the Nelson Mandela Center. So students transcribed over 66,000 names into an Excel sheet. And this Excel sheet was used to help the Nelson Mandela Center start with the compilation of slave genealogies. So of course, this is not so easy because most slaves did not keep any documents with them. Their names have been changed, of course, from their original names. And what we wanted to show was there are some successes. There are some families who can trace their family genealogy, and in doing so, helps us build up the Mauritian history, because we have huge gaps in our knowledge of history of what happened to the slaves after abolition of slavery. There's a gap from 1839 up to the 1850s where we cannot trace some of the slaves. Even the census records are completely silent on that. The archives are silent on that. It seems as if they have disappeared from sight in those 10 years. So this population movement can be traced by meticulous study, looking at individual families. And over the years, hopefully, we will be able to build a better picture of the movement of slaves after the abolition of slavery. So far, we still have not much information on what happened to the bulk, the 66,000 slaves who left plantations or left their owners and so on. So this is work in progress, and we hope maybe in the next few years to have more information to share with you. And this is the first book written on the history of women. We published this during the pandemic, so it was published online. So we've now produced a second edition, which hopefully will be available in bookshops in the next few weeks in Mauritius. So we have researchers from all over the world who participated in it, and we hope to continue producing further volumes. The third topic Elsa wanted me to talk about was marooning and marronage. So I've talked a little bit about it in relation to women. So we have different types of marronage. We have marooning, which is long-term marooning, and short-term marooning. And the slides you see here are from archaeological project looking at forests and caves in Mauritius and how far maroon slaves had used them. So these are some dramatic pictures. This is an ex-student sitting very high on top of a mountain in a cave, which was excavated and found to have artifacts in it. So we assumed, I think, quite correctly at that time, that who else but a maroon would have gone to such a dangerous location. If you look down from the cave, this is what you see. So there are myths about this mountain of maroons jumping off the cliff. I'm not totally convinced with that story, but this is something that deserves to be explored. Apart from caves and mountains, we also found, sorry, the next slide, several other types of marronage. These are what you'd call maritime marronage. So this is a picture you see here is the town of Port Louis in the 18th century. And it is this harbor, the Trou-Fanfaron, which had, of course, many boats moored there. And some slaves, we don't know exactly how many, used to come and steal the boats at night and then try and go away with them. How do we know about this? Because unfortunately for many of them, they were caught and brought back to Mauritius and prosecuted. We don't know, however, about those who succeeded and tried to reach Réunion or Madagascar. So we don't know about those who did succeed, if they did succeed. But maritime marronage was a big not as major as running away into the woods and the forests and the caves, but it was quite consequent in the 18th century. Another type of marronage we have in Mauritius was urban marronage. So this is slaves running away from their owners and entering the town. So it's mainly the town of Port Louis, but we also had another important center, which was Maibo, which is in the south east of the island, which also attracted a lot of slaves. So one distinction between a slave, how you would recognize a slave and a free person, was because a free person wore shoes. A slave was not allowed to wear shoes. So the first thing a maroon slave would have done when they enter the town of Port Louis was to begin wearing shoes and to start dressing well. And you see this in the advertisements for maroon slaves when owners advertise the fact that their slave had run away, that he had been seen walking in the streets of Port Louis dressed in all his in finery, in jewelry, etc. So this was a very important form of escape from slavery, mingling into the free population of Port Louis, what Megan Vaughan has called passing for white. So being well dressed, wearing shoes, and even getting jobs across the town. The next topic was the Truth and Justice Commission. So I was the vice chairperson. This was a momentous occasion for many Mauritians. The person you see on your left here, Mr. Silvio Michel, he had been asking for a commission to investigate the consequences and effects of slavery and to discuss compensation for descendants of slaves since the 1960s. So he carried on his campaign for many years, had several thousand followers, not many, but quite a few. And it's only in 2009 that the government agreed to have a commission to look at the consequences of slavery and to make recommendations based on those studies. Unfortunately for the commissioners, the government also went through parliament. They also added two other mandates. One was to also look at the consequences of indentured labor, and to look at cases of land dispossession. So this was added on because many descendants of ex-slaves had made complaints in the past that they had lost land that they had once owned. They had heard from oral tradition and oral history that their families had owned land in the past, and they all wondered why they had lost this land and so on. So the mandate of the TJC started off with just being about slavery, but also included now indenture and why people had been dispossessed of their land. And so this was an import. It lasted 2 years. We asked for an extension of 6 months and obtained it. We knew 2 years was not enough to study, of course, the consequences of slavery, indenture, and to study the hundreds of cases of land dispossession that we were confronted with. But we did decide from the very beginning that even though 2 years was not enough, we would do the maximum as far as studies were concerned, in-depth studies were concerned. And Richard was one of those land consultants, along with, I think, nearly 50 other researchers were recruited. So it was a massive research project being undertaken for 2 years. And I would say that even though the recommendations were not all, most of them have not been implemented or being implemented, not possibly in the right spirit. The volumes, 4 volumes of written reports and two others of audiovisual reports are today a reference, considered very important reference material for many researchers and lawyers and so on, and also for those civil servants who are slowly trying to understand the report and why these recommendations were made. Some of these studies included archaeological work, and here on your left, this is again Le Morne Mountain, and there was an abandoned cemetery there which no one knew who was buried there. And the whole village of Le Morne participated in the archaeological excavations. And we discovered nearly 40 tombs. The archaeologist, Dr. Sita, I think it's about 40 or 43 tombs. About 13 were excavated, and all of them were found to be of African Malagasy descent, origins. So this confirmed to us this was either a slave cemetery or an ex-slave cemetery, because there was, of course, the village nearby. So the deceased of the slaves or ex-slaves may be buried there. So this was a very interesting findings to make. Also, what I think satisfied me the most, this is another village in Le Morne. It is called Trouchani, and this goes to show the continuity of some aspects of slavery in our modern day Mauritius. So the villagers whom you see here, they belong to a village called Trouchani, and in the 1940s and again in the 1960s, they were forcibly evacuated from their village. So the reason given by the landowner was that he needed the land for cattle, deer breeding. Deer is a very important commodity in Mauritius. So he gave 24 hours to the inhabitants to leave their huts, and they were given land elsewhere. So they ended up in the village of Le Morne, and they were one of the first hearings to be made in the village. Most hearings of the commission were made in the capital city in Port-Louis, but the commission decided to move out of the capital and go and visit several places. So the inhabitants of Trouchani, who were by now very elderly, were very um, were very and I wouldn't say not happy, but they were very happy to be given the opportunity to explain their story and what had happened. And here is one of the granddaughters of the women who testified, and because she was able to express and collect much more information and give it to the commission. And I think the recommendations were fortunately accepted. And so this is one example of one small success of the commission. Another important study was done of a housing estate, also in the same district of Rivière Noire, Black River district. And this was to show the continuity from slave camp to housing estate. And the anthropologist who did the research was able to show that the migration of descendants of slaves up to the modern period, their children and their grandchildren, that they all came from the same area and then moved out of Mauritius, but some of them landed in this housing estate. So this was quite an important revelation that the genealogies of people could be reconstructed very easily from this. So this is just a screenshot of some of the recommendations, 290 recommendations. Unfortunately, when the report came out, the press focused on only one issue, which was the issue of not reparations, but compensation. So the volumes, they could see the volumes and the CDs, etc. But the headlines in most of the papers were cash compensation out. In other words, the commission decided on reparations rather than giving a cash compensation to descendants of slave families. Okay, so in terms of teaching about all this in Mauritius, as I said before, we need to be aware of what students are bringing into the classroom. We have most of our classrooms are multicultural classrooms. People have come from very many different origins. They're very much mixed. We have several languages being spoken in the same family. They come from different ethnicities and so on. And for the teacher, this is what I I had to learn by a hard experience, and my colleagues also, is that you need to moderate the words and the terms that you use in the classroom, because there's a very real danger of people being offended. And you also have to moderate what history to teach and how to teach it. So it's not so much what to teach, but how you teach it in a way that you show cultural sensitivity. And the big issue in Mauritius for me, when I looked at colleagues and younger teachers who have to teach the history of slavery, history of Mauritius, history of indenture, they are not trained um, in culture. They don't have cultural sensitivity classes. They do not know the history of Mauritius fully enough. And sometimes they also have prejudices themselves, which they talk about in class, and this upsets students in class. The other difficulty we have to do, this is very specific to Mauritius, is that history is an optional subject in schools. Students come to us from the elementary level having done some history, but by the time they reach secondary and tertiary education, a lot of it is lost. There's a lot of rote learning. Teachers don't really know. We don't have good history books for teachers or for children in Mauritius. So teachers tend to give students a list of ministers or list of French governors, list of British governors to to learn by heart. And this is what they have to reproduce at exam time. So it has changed a little bit now, but unfortunately, this is the case. So by the time they reach high school and university, they have forgotten everything, and we literally have to start from scratch again. What is history? What are the methods used by historians? What is interdisciplinary history? And we also have students that have said we have to counter the demagogy that we hear in the public and among politicians and some intellectuals and so on. So these are the issues. I don't know if that's the case in the US, but this is what we face in Mauritius today. I also encourage students very much to look at the environment. As I said earlier, our history is all around us in Mauritius. Even though we're being built over by concrete, there's so much of what is around us that is reminiscent of our past. The buildings, the roads, the bridges, the agriculture that we practice, all has a history behind it. Um, Finally, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I would like to talk a little bit about the project of a slavery museum in Mauritius. So this was a recommendation of the Truth and Justice Commission. And one of the reasons for the recommending setting up a museum of slavery is that one is specifically for the Mauritian population, the descendants of slaves, families who are descended from slavery, up to now do not have a museum where they can go to and explain to their children or their grandchildren their own history. So the idea of having a museum of slavery is so that the part of the population that still does not have a museum dedicated to its history, this is a huge gap in our cultural scenery in Mauritius. So it is very important to have all the components of the Mauritian population. Their history has to be represented in one form or another in Mauritius, either in a museum or in film or some permanent structure. And we felt at that time it was very important that this museum be in Port Louis itself, in the capital city, fully visible, not in an isolated place, but right in the city center. So it would be visible and seen by not just Mauritians, but by visitors, tourists, and so on. Slavery should not be hidden. The history of slavery should not be hidden, but should be there, right in the city center for everybody to see. So that was the aim. And so that has taken, the Truth and Justice Commission ended in 2011. It is only 10 years later, 2021, after many workshops, many lectures, many petitions, which Richard also and Chaplin participated in, trying to do a little bit of, as we say in Mauritius, forcing on the government to set up this museum. So this is what finally the government decided to set up the museum. They set up a private company, a state company. So that I don't know if you want to know the reason for the state company is because we did not trust the bureaucracy to set up a museum. They had slept on the project for 10 years, and the Ministry of Finance said, if you want this to move fast, set up a state company, and you won't have to go through all the bureaucracy that most ministries have to go through. So that was the story, and a state company was set up, and they're working on temporary exhibitions for the time being, and hopefully we will have a museum in a few years to come. So the reason we chose one particular building, this is the oldest building of the island. This is the oldest map I was able to find. This is the military hospital built by Governor Labourdonnais in the French period, completed in 1740. And one of these, when epidemics broke out in the late 18th century, cholera, smallpox, one of these was even converted into a slave hospital because of the number of deaths occurring among government slaves. Also, this building was built by African and Malagasy slaves, Indian masons and bricklayers, French artisans, and later Creole-born, Mauritian-born slaves. So it is a site that reminds us of our multicultural history and how different nationalities have contributed to the building of modern Mauritius. So these are the reasons why the building was chosen. And fortunately, it was still a state building and had not yet been restored for many, many years. And so this was accepted also by government. So I hope in the next few years we will see something like that. So the
Vijaya,
museum project is not,
I don't want to cut you
yeah,
short, but I want to make
yeah,
sure we wrap up to just to give people to ask
yes, yes.
questions
This
of
is the
your
last
wonderful
slide.
presentation. Great.
Yeah, this is the last slide actually. The museum project doesn't want to be a static museum, but also to help the community. And so we have involved young people from disadvantaged communities to participate in the restoration of this very old building. And so we had 15 youths, some of which are going to be employed in the future museum. Thank you.